Great. So hello, welcome, Cześć. Today we'll talk about rapid and type-safe Node.js development with Prisma. Before I get started, I'd like to thank Karol and Alexandra and the rest of the Wrocław TypeScript team for this invitation. I think 2020 has been a wild year, and like transitioning to this online format, as we discussed just seconds ago, it's quite an undertaking. So it's really nice to see how you're like putting this together, or while you have jobs on the side. So I'm really honored to have this opportunity to speak here. And more than anything, I'd like this talk to be the beginning of a conversation. And I would love to hear your thoughts and kind of like, what are your problems working with databases? Yeah. So a little bit about myself. My name's Daniel. I'm a developer advocate at Prisma. My background is as a full stack developer for the last 10 years or so. And in this period, I've focused on different parts of the stack, from the front end to the back end, and I've done a bit of DevOps and infrastructure work. I mentioned also this before to Alexandra, and I have a personal connection to Wrocław, as my father lived close by in a town called Legnica back in the 50s. So I feel really special to have this opportunity. And before we get started, I'm not sure how many we are right now, but I'd like to start with a survey. You can join this survey by going to Slido and put in the code 333666, or you can just scan the QR code. And what I'm interested to hear is, what kind of database are you using? And then I also have a second question, which is what you use. So I would really love it if you could go and share your results. And hopefully also I'll be able to sort of address the talk in a way that takes that into account. So it's already nice to see Postgres leading the poll. I think Postgres has been really rising in popularity recently, and it's such an established technology. And I guess that applies to relational database in general. Okay. Now, what kind of database access library do you use? You use ORMs. You could share which kind of ORM you use. You use a query builder or any other kind of, like maybe the Postgres driver or like the native driver, and you use raw SQL queries. Let's see. Okay, nice. Very nice, okay. We've got some raw SQL fans here. All right, hopefully I can surprise you. All right, we'll continue now. So our agenda for today, I'll close this up. We'll start with the introduction, and in the introduction, we'll discuss the problem space of working with databases in Node.js and how Prisma can help with that. We'll then take a closer look at Prisma and how it might be the actual solution for some of these problems. And lastly, I'll finish up with a live demo. So it's 2020 and you want to build a web app. The first thing I think you need to think about is, where are you going to store your data? The reason for this is because most applications today are data intensive, in the sense that the functionality that they offer is based on their ability to store, manipulate, and retrieve data. So most apps rely on some kind of persistent storage, typically in a database. And in this diagram that I have here, we have like a typical architecture for a web app where the API technology might be REST or GraphQL or even gRPC, if that's your thing. And the Node.js server doesn't even have to be a Node.js server. It can be any kind of like server technology or language. And it might even be a long-running thing or a Lambda/serverless function. And so when it comes to the options that you have backend as a service options like Firebase, AWS AppSync, and these things handle a lot of the concerns for you when it comes to your data, but they require you to often learn a proprietary technology that comes with a vendor lock-in. And another thing is that they're often not standardized. So each kind of like backend as a service has its own thing. Then you have self-hosted backend as a service options, things like Hazura, which supports Postgres, and recently also added support for MySQL. And also Supabase, which some of you may know, And I think it also works exclusively with Postgres. And these are really great if you're looking to purely build a GraphQL API or like a REST API and you want to get started pretty quickly. If you go down the route, and this is like the third option of building something yourself, you have to choose a database technology. You might use a relational database like Postgres and MySQL, like we saw in the poll result, or MongoDB if you're going down the NoSQL route. The main point here is that whichever database technology you choose will influence almost every decision about your application. And this kind of leads us to one of the main challenges in the current Node.js ecosystem. And that is that working with databases in Node.js is difficult. There are basically three categories of tools when it comes to working with relational databases. We have plain SQL, and we saw again in the poll results, some people really feel comfortable with SQL and they prefer to send raw queries. We have SQL query builders like Next, which was also mentioned in the survey. And then we have ORMs. And each of these approaches comes with their own sort of set of problems and pitfalls. And I suggest if you're really interested to getting like a comparison between, we have this article that sort of like compares the three levels of abstraction. And additionally, if you're interested in some of the specific pitfalls to ORMs, I suggest you look up, there's these two terms that you can look up called the object impedance mismatch and the Vietnam of computer science. But I think Prisma, which may be the solution for a lot of these problems, the main thing it offers is it makes working with databases easy. So Prisma, what is Prisma? Prisma is an open source database toolkit, and it consists of three tools. The first one is Prisma Client, which can be used in Node.js and TypeScript project, and it replaces what the ORMs, query builders, and the database drivers would typically do. Then we have Prisma Migrate, which is used for database migrations. And in case you're not so familiar with database migrations are what we refer to as the way to change the database schema over time. So if you're working with a relational database, you have to define a schema up front. And then every time you want to make a change to the database, you have to sort of alter the schema of the database. And usually there are many migration tools that will allow you to do that. And typically those migration tools, you will write either raw SQL or you will construct programmatically SQL that will alter the tables of your database schema. And so Prisma Migrate is slightly different because it takes a declarative approach rather than an imperative approach. So when you write a database migration, normally you write SQL, and that is somewhat imperative, whereas a declarative migration, the idea is that you just declare your schema as you want it to be, and Prisma Migrate figures out the changes that need to be carried out in the database. And then lastly, we have the third tool, Prisma Studio, which is like a modern, intuitive, and easy to use database GUI. And we'll look at that in the demo in a sec. So what are the goals of Prisma? Well, the first one is to boost productivity. And we do that by letting developers query data in natural and familiar ways, especially in the context of Node.js and TypeScript. And then second, increase confidence. And, you know, I don't need to preach to the choir. This is a TypeScript meetup, so I'm sure many of you have already made the jump to TypeScript from JavaScript. And you're familiar with some of the benefits of type safety. And so a lot of that confidence comes down to type safety, but one of the side effects is also that you get, through type safety, you get very rich auto completion when you're writing code, and you get a very robust query API with Prisma. So how do we do that? Well, first thing is Prisma allows you to think in objects rather than SQL. And so every Prisma client call maps to a type, and the result when you're running when you write your queries using the client API, you can know sort of the result type ahead of running the query. And this doesn't require you to write really any TypeScript types. And we'll see how that happens. The second thing is working intuitively with relations. And fetching relations is easy with the Fluent API because you don't actually need to do joins across tables. Instead, you get this programmatic and intuitive API, which allows you to define what data you want to get. And immediately, as you write the query, you can already know what the resulting type will be. Then we have the auto completion and type safety, and this is end-to-end. So all queries that you run using Prisma Client will be type safe, with the exception, of course, of raw SQL, which Prisma Client also supports. And then we have the declarative and human readable database schema. And this is the main sort of database schema that I mentioned before that can be used also for declarative database migrations. And then lastly, you have a single source of truth for both your database and your application models. And so this is really where it differs from a lot of the other solutions out there. If you're using, say, an ORM, you often have to define your model classes, and those model classes have to actually map the database schema. And so the responsibility of synchronizing between these two type systems, the type system of the database that you're working with and the type system of the language that you're working in, is something that is your responsibility. By having this single source of truth, what Prisma actually does is it generates code for you, and that code is always in sync with your database because you use the same schema to generate the database schema. And by that, I mean the Prisma schema. Okay, let's do a live demo. And before we do that, I always like to pray to the demo gods. And if that doesn't work, at least I'll try to be as calm as the Dalai Lama. So let's get to it. Let me open up my editor. And oh yeah, I'll go back to the slides so that you can see. Let's see. So what are we going to do? The first thing we're going to do is, in this live demo, is we're going to create the Postgres database schema with Prisma Migrate. And to do that, we'll look at the Prisma schema, which is the single source of truth. Then we'll install and generate Prisma Client. And then we'll use Prisma Client to actually perform database operations, so you can get a feel for this, for the Prisma Client API. And then lastly, I'll show Prisma Studio, which can be used to explore data. Okay, so coming back to my editor, what we're looking at here is a little project that I have set up. There's not a lot going on here. And here we have this Prisma folder, which has this schema.prisma. And this is this single source of truth that I spoke about. And every Prisma schema contains these two blocks here, the generator. And here we define that we want the JavaScript Prisma client, which is actually TypeScript. And here we define the data source, which actually connects to a database. I haven't actually created this database yet because that will be created in a moment with Prisma Migrate. And then these are the models. So each one of these models maps to a database table. And each model can contain multiple fields. There's also like quite rich auto completion. So if I were to add like a last name, or you know what, I'll go for a surname, I can define that as a string, and I have all of the types here. And I can also do the auto formatting. And this is where it gets really interesting. So first of all, we have these field attributes here. And these are the ways that we can sort of define things like indices or constraints on certain fields, like unique constraint, this is the primary key, or a default value. And so, for example, in the case of, say, a Boolean field, we can set the default to false or true as we like it. And where it gets really interesting is how we define relations. So typically in relational databases, we have one-to-one relations, we have one-to-many, and we have many-to-many relations. And here I've actually set up two one-to-many relations. And these are, one user can have multiple posts, and every user can have multiple comments. Now, there's also a relationship between posts and comments. So a single post can have multiple comments. And we do that by defining these relation fields. So here we have the relation scalar, and this is the actual field that will store the reference. the author is pointing to the user model. And then comments actually defines, hey, I can have here many comments, and that points to the comments model. And so in this comment model, I'm actually linking, there's two relations here. One is linking it back to the post that the comment was for, and one is linking it to the author of that comment. And so here we can actually, we need to, the distinction to be made here is between the relation scalar and the relation field. The relation scalar is the actual field that will store the foreign key, whereas the relation field, and you can identify the relation fields because their type is pointing to another model. So user will be the actual way that you can access via the programmatic API, the relation. And so this can actually be named anything. This could be named author if that feels more befitting. And here we sort of pass the relation and we tell it, hey, the relation scalar field is the user ID. That's where the foreign key is installed. And it references the ID field of the user model. And so I'll keep that user now to keep it just simple. So that was our database schema. And typically, if you're starting a new project and you want to use something like Postgres, then the first thing you would do is you would start by defining this data model, and you would like sort of map out your problem domain. You can do this, you know, this is a really good exercise. I mean, you can do it in a sort of domain-driven design approach where you sort of try to map out the problem and then you sort of write this schema. And then once you have the schema, we can go ahead and actually start by running the migration. And so for that, I'm going to need Prisma installed, and I'll just show the package JSON here. So here I have the Prisma CLI and Prisma client. These are the two dependencies that I need in order to use the three tools that I mentioned: Prisma client, Prisma migrate, and Prisma Studio. And so with these already installed, I can run Prisma migrate. Now I should point out that Prisma migrate is still experimental. However, we're aiming, this is one of our core focuses right now, and in the coming months, we hope to have it available for GA, for general availability. And so the first thing when you create a migration is you need to save it. And when you save it, what happens is it actually takes a snapshot of the schema as it is, and saves that into your repository. And to those of you who've worked with migrations, this is a common practice. You usually save all of your migrations in the repository, and then that way you can sort of run them in every environment. So you have a local environment, a staging environment, and a production environment. You can sort of run them and be sure that if it's in your source code repository, all places will have, all environments will have the same database schema. And so I will save this, and it's detected that this database doesn't exist. So yes, I want to create it. And great, that was saved. I think I may have already saved it. So I will delete the migrations folder, run it again to showcase. And then it asks me for the name. I'm just going to do enter. And okay, so we got this migration that was created for us in this Prisma migrations folder. And now we can run it. So I will run that using the up command. And it created all of those for me. Now let's verify that. And I'll use PG CLI. By the way, is the font big enough for you to read it? Because I can make it bigger.
It's good.
It's cool. Great. Thank you. Okay, cool. So PG CLI is very similar to the Postgres CLI, but it has some really nice auto completion. And so I can do things like this, and I can sort of, actually, I want to connect to the Wroclaw. And here I can list all of the different tables. And so if we look at, say, the user table, we see that it has these three fields, and it's referenced by both the post and the comment table. So let's look at the post. And so here we see, again, we have this default false as we set it. And we also have this next val, which will ensure that the ID is auto incremented. So that's all good. The database schema has been created. That's already a good start. Now, I think we can actually go ahead and install Prisma client. I've already installed it in the package JSON. So all we need to do now is just generate the Prisma client, which is generated again based on the Prisma schema. To do that, I will just run Prisma generate. And so it loads the Prisma schema and then generates that into Node modules. And so now we have all of these types and we have this rich client that is actually based on our database schema. So, okay, let's give this a go. And for that, I've opened up, I've created this script here called script clean. And it doesn't do much. Really, I just have a bunch of to-dos here. And here I'm using the constructor to instantiate Prisma. And what I want to show now is I've created these to-dos so that I can showcase what is it like to use it to actually save and work with the database. And so here I want to create the first user and create 2 associated posts, one of which will be published, and also include the relation in the response. So the first thing we need to do is await prisma.user.create. And as I open up the brackets, we start getting some of that juicy auto completion. And so here you can see I already have all of the different fields. So let's create that at prisma.io and then name Alexandra. And now we want to create posts. And so we have 2 options here. We can connect an existing post to this user, or we can create a new one, which is what we want to do. In fact, we want to create 2. And then here I'm going to open up the object. And then if I do control space to open up the auto completion, you can already see all of this is really, it's fully typed. And so first post by Alexandra. Let's give it some content, why you should use TypeScript in 2020. And let's set published to true. And so if I try to put a non-existent field here, like hello world, you can already see that I'm getting this type error. And so that's already nice. Now we're going to create another post. And this will be the second post, but it won't be published. Oops. And now say I wanted to know, hey, what's going on here? I can actually see the full sort of type. So let me just reload TS server. So here, if I hover over this, am I doing this right? Yeah, that looks correct. Let's try running this. So npm run demo, and that will run this script clean. And so great, we created this user. But what if we wanted to get also the created posts? By default, Prisma won't return any of the related rows that we create. And so here we have this include property, which we can actually use to fetch the different posts. So if I run this again, you will see that I get user 1 and I have all of the posts. And so here, if I try to access, say, something like non-existent, I will get this type error because it doesn't exist on this, the type that was automatically inferred. And I can also, you know, I get the auto completion also for the result. And so that was the first user. Now let's create a second user. And also for the second user, we're going to create a comment for one of the posts from the first user. So here we use the create again, data, and we'll pass a name. We'll choose a nice Polish name. Give it an email, say jakub@prisma.io. And we want to also set a comment, right? Create a comment here. And so here again, I have this option to either connect or create. We want to create a new one. and I have to tell it, hey, which post are you creating it for? And so I'm going to connect that to user1 posts, the first post dot ID. I think that's one way to do it. Also, I can just pass here this ID. And okay, so we've created the connection to the post in this comment, but we haven't actually created the comment. And so interesting idea. And there we go. So as we go along, we know the auto completion helps us and also the type safety. And so if we run this now, we will get also this user2. And I want to get also these comments, all right? Or you know what, let's move on to the third to do of getting the published posts and their comments. And so to do that, I will go wait.prisma.posts.findMany, where, and then here again, I have all of the sort of conditions that I can do, and I just want to get the ones that published is true. And I want to also get their comments. And so I'm going to use include for that. And I've just run prettier to get it all nice. And so let's look at what the result looks like. And so here we have the result for that query. We have the post. We can see that because it's in an array. And then we have this first post and we have the comment. But assuming that we wanted to actually get the information about who was this user, then really this is all as simple as include here author true. And here we can actually pass to also and author, instead of using create, I'm going to actually use connect. And I could pass just the email here as a string, or I could use the second one. We have this second post, which doesn't have any comments because we haven't created. And so that's a bit of the Prisma client API. Now I want to show Prisma Studio. So this is really useful. Also, we have the comments, and so you can really like go through all of the different slides. And where do we have them? Let me see. Okay. Oh, there we go. So that was that. Now, before I wrap up, let me see. How do I navigate here? I'm sorry. doesn't seem to want to do that. The internet, let's see. Can I get this loading? All right. Okay, this is the moment to remember the Dalai Lama and present. And here we are, and we are at the end. And so we were here. And just before we wrap up, I want to talk about adopting Prisma gradually. So far, I showed in the example project using Prisma. But what about the case where you have an existing project and you want to adopt it? The diagram below actually shows how you can do that. So Prisma is really nice in terms of how you can adopt it gradually. Essentially, you use this feature called introspection, which you run, and what Prisma does is it introspects your database, and based on that, it populates your Prisma schema with all of the models. And then you simply run Prisma generate as we did, and then you have this generated client, which gives you a fully type-safe database access client. And so in the real world, you probably don't want to just be writing scripts accessing the database. And for that, you can integrate it into a REST API. And that's the example that I have here on the right, where you have a sort of like a root handler. And in that root handler, you accept maybe some user input. You probably want to validate it, even though Prisma will also validate it at runtime too. And then you sort of use Prisma client there. And then on the left, we have the GraphQL example, which is sort of like how we would use Prisma in a GraphQL resolver. Now, these are really obviously primitive examples, and some of you, I'm sure, are much more advanced than this when it comes to building APIs. And so, if you're really interested in looking at some of the examples, we have examples for both JavaScript and TypeScript, GraphQL using the SDL first approach and the code first approach with Type GraphQL and Nexus Schema, and also examples using Apollo and Next.js. And so that was it for me. Thank you so much for your attention. If you have any questions, I think this is the time.
Thank you, Daniel. Thank you. It was an amazing talk. I think it was also very helpful for me because I'm actually starting a new side project and I'm going to use a Blitz.js and it's using Prisma under the hood. So that was a nice walkthrough for me to get familiar with Prisma and tooling and so on. So thanks a lot.
Glad it helped.
Yeah. Okay, so you can ask questions in the chat. So unfortunately, I was disconnected for a moment, and I don't. So my chat is clear right now, and I don't see anything. So if there was something in the meantime, let me know. Otherwise, we'll wait a few minutes. Oh, Carol mentioned that there wasn't.
Question about tooling. How are the schema and the generated types kept in sync? When you edit your Prisma, your schema Prisma, do you have to remember to regenerate your types in order to avoid discrepancies? Yes, you do. So, I mean, basically when you edit if you edit your schema Prisma, then there's two things that you probably want to do. You want to run the migration, and then you want to generate the types. And so that's your responsibility. You have to run that, because otherwise the generated code It's not in sync. But this is not such a big problem because the generated code is typically not imported into, it's not in the Git repository. And so when you're checking it out, you will usually be generating it quite often. I mean, as often as you install your dependencies and as often as you change your database schema.
Okay, thank you. Actually, I have one question. So I would usually like in the past, I would use like raw SQL instead of any like, tools or RAMs and so on, because I was always pretty skeptical. Of course, I know that Prisma is not an ORM, but still I was skeptical to this kind of tools, because what will happen if I really need to write some SQL, like do something more complex, like I don't know, write check constraints in Postgres or Postgres triggers, or I don't know, use statement timeout, some things that really require using SQL. So how is it possible with Prisma?
So Prisma offers an escape hatch, and it has a raw SQL functionality. You don't get the sort of, it's when you write a raw SQL query, it's up to you to type your result, but you get the full sort of functionality through raw SQL. And so really the only difference, if you want to do really specific stuff and complex joins or whatnot, you can do that with Prisma. There is a raw function, which is on the root object, and you can use that to send queries. And then it's your responsibility to make sure that the types are, that you've correctly typed the result.
Okay, and what if I, for example, I'm creating some query with with this query builder, like I'm adding new table or something like that, and like in the same query I would like to add some custom SQL that probably, I don't know, maybe something that is not supported yet by functions provided by Prisma, or just something that is new in Postgres or something like this. Is it possible to kind of like glue those two kinds of this raw SQL with Prisma builders?
It's possible within an application, but not within a single query. So, you have to make the choice when you start the query. Is this going to be a raw query, or is this going to be using the programmatic sort of client API?
Okay, I see. Thank you. Okay, I see we have another question from Jakub.
Jakub, what would be the benefits of using Prisma over typed GraphQL on the front end side? Okay, that's a good question. So first of all, it's worth mentioning that Prisma itself is not an API technology. Rather, it's a database access tool. And so we're doing a lot of work on improving sort of the broader ecosystem of like making it possible to easily build GraphQL APIs with Prisma using Nexus schema. And so it's difficult to compare, it's like comparing tomatoes to cucumbers. So sure, you can build GraphQL APIs with Prisma. And then if you build a GraphQL API, you can build a GraphQL API with Apollo. In fact, the example I gave in the end was using Apollo. I can also share a link to the examples repository where we have an example that uses Apollo with Prisma. And then on the front side, you don't really need to worry about, so once you've built your GraphQL API with Prisma on the front end, you don't really need to think about Prisma. The main thing you need to think about is GraphQL, because that is your main interface. And so everything behind that interface is what you've already implemented in your GraphQL API. Does that seem to make sense?
I wonder because let's say relay. So would you use both Prisma and let's say relay on the front end side? Because I would think that you would just use one or another, yeah, not two. You would.
On the front end side, you would purely use relay. You don't need Prisma on the client side.
Okay. So if you have GraphQL API, you would stick with relay, yeah, on the front end side, yeah, or Apollo, because it maybe guarantees a little bit more like synchronization of data or this kind of things, yeah.
it's not so much, I guess, a problem on the client side. I mean, that's a lot of that is handled by Apollo or by Relay.
Okay. All right. Okay. Okay. Thanks.
Okay. Can I use Prisma to connect to multiple databases? So we have this in the pipeline. You can also, maybe I'll share a link to the roadmap. And we have a lot of users, and there's an open issue for that. And that is definitely one of the things that's going to come in the, hopefully in the coming months, multiple databases. And then, okay. So Carol, great question. What about the performance of queries generated by Prisma? How do they compare to handcrafted SQL queries or to queries generated by other tools? Is performance a priority for you right now, or is it something you decided to tackle later? So this is something we'll be, so first of all, is the performance is not quite as good as raw SQL. That's something I can say up front. But that's bound to change. That's because there's a lot of optimizations that can be done. In fact, if you're building a GraphQL API, the N+1 problem is already solved for you. You don't need to add a data loader. And that is because the underlying implementation of Prisma is using Rust. So you might not notice this, but there's what we call the Prisma engine, which runs under the hood when you start Prisma client, when you instantiate it in your code. And that actually manages a lot of the connection to the database. And so performance is definitely something that is on our radar, and we're going to improve that. And a lot of the work that has been done thus far is about setting up the infrastructures so that can be done very effectively. And so I can expect that to get much better right now. Yeah, and I hope that answers your question, Colin. Yeah, great. Okay, question, WRT API technologies. What is WRT?
With regards to, sorry.
Say again?
With regards to.
Okay.
Yeah,
okay.
I wanted to continue that topic.
All right, great. With regards to API technology, I used GraphQL framework a few years ago. I can see that the repository is archived now. I'm interested in the decision-making behind this. Can we say that you took a step back from the focus on lower level problems? Well, I think, so interesting question. So GraphQL framework was really like the open source code that ran GraphQL, which was the first iteration of what Prisma was doing prior to what it's doing right now. And GraphQL was a backend as a service technology. Basically, you define a schema and you get a full GraphQL API, and you don't need to worry about databases or anything. You just define the schema, the GraphQL schema, and you get this fully working API, and you don't need to worry about the database. Actually, it turned out that that's one of the reasons for the pivot was because it's quite complicated doing this kind of thing and doing it well. And so open sourcing it was something that was like sharing it with the community. But it turned out that actually one of the big problems that exists right now, and one of the main reasons I think that a lot of developers are going for backend as a service options is because it's quite difficult to work with databases, especially relational databases. And so by focusing really on the database access layer, we've actually moved lower level because it's a lower level abstraction than, you know, a backend as a service. So I hope that kind of answers your question. Okay.
Kind of.
Either way, Piotr, feel free to reach out. Like, I'd love to continue this conversation. You know, if nothing comes to mind now, don't feel the pressure. Like, you know, we can continue this chat. I'm really happy to, and we can hash it out.
Yeah, sure. So I understand you just wanted to focus on the core problem, right? Just change the scale so you can fix the smaller part of the problem first, and then maybe revisit backend as a service after Prisma is stable and popular, right?
Mm-hmm.
Cool.
Potentially.
Potentially. I wanted to mention that Prisma Studio, I've only seen this in your talk for the first time, it looks super fancy. Like especially when I remember GraphQL, I think that there is a huge improvement.
Thank you.
To how the data is displayed.
Yeah, we've worked quite a bit on it, and it literally just reached stable. So it was experimental for a while, and I think it was 2 weeks ago that it came out of experimental, and it's now stable.
Sweet, thank you.
Thank you.